I was on mute. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Sadie, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Very good to have all of you guys join with us for our National HoUSed campaign call. We're going to give folks a minute or two to get on the line, and then we can get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call. My name is Sarah Sadie, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Our National HoUSed campaign focuses on advancing the anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale investments that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. You may remember that we launched this campaign because we recognize that more than ever, bold policies would be needed to ensure that the people with the lowest incomes, those who are the most marginalized, would have access to an affordable, stable home. I'm just going to remind all of our speakers if they could just mute their lines while I remind folks about who we have on the call this week or on every week. We have advocates from across the country who are listening in today, including homeless shelter and service providers, housing advocates. We have resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income people who are either receiving or are in need of federal assistance. We have people who are experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, researchers, media on the line. So a really broad audience with us today. And for today's call, we're going to hear from some national experts about some work around rent reporting, but also some risks that might be there for renters and people with low incomes. We're going to hear an update from our ERASE cohort, our ERASE team, about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and we'll hear field updates from Louisiana and DC, and I'll give an update about the chaos that is ensuing in Washington, DC right now around the appropriations bill and around tax extenders. So to get started, we're just going to jump right in, and we're going to turn it over to Chi-Chi Wu from the National Consumer Law Center, who's been doing some great work identifying some of the risks of rent reporting that you should all be aware about. And I'll hand it over to you, Chi-Chi.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. My name is Chi-Chi Wu. I'm a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, the one before, yeah. Thank you. So this is a slide that just tells you a little bit about National Consumer Law Center and what we do. We mostly do policy and advocacy work focused on consumer finance issues. And I, in particular, work on credit reporting and other types of consumer reporting issues like tenant screening. The two things I want you to take away about National Consumer Law Center is, number one, we do provide brief technical assistance to advocates. So if you're an advocate or an attorney helping out a renter and there's a particular issue, a Fair Credit Reporting Act, Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, or other consumer laws, feel free to reach out to us. We cannot give advice to individual consumers for various reasons, but we can work with advocates and attorneys representing others. The other thing I want to mention is we do have a monthly call on credit and reporting and tenant screening issues. So if you're a housing advocate that is interested in tenant screening regulation at the state level, you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you on our call. And you can just reach out to me directly. I'll put my email address in the chat after my segment. So what is rent reporting? Rent reporting are these efforts to get monthly rent payment history into credit reports. Next slide, please. And the reason there's been such activity around rent reporting is because in 2015, 2016, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau did this report showing that 26 million Americans, about 1 in 10, don't have a credit history, and another 18 million have a credit history that's so thin or scant that they can't generate a credit score. And these are what are called the credit invisible consumers. They're disproportionately Black and Latino, as you can see from this chart. And since this report came out, there's been all this effort to try to help the credit invisibles build credit records. Next slide, please. The other issue is that if you look at credit reports as a group for Black and Latino consumers as a group, there tend to be lower credit scores. And there's multiple studies showing this. It has to do with things like the racial wealth gap and histories and legacy of discrimination that still kind of carry forward till today. But the problem, and I think this is worse than just the credit invisibility, is that these credit records end up hurting not only the ability of Black and brown consumers to get affordable, reasonably priced credit, but also jobs, insurance, and rental housing. Next slide, please. And these are some older studies that basically show the same thing. Next slide, please. So, as most of the folks on this call probably know, in the summer of 2020, there were all these protests spurred by George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders, the Black Lives Matter movement, and you had all these corporations trying to show that they cared about Black Lives Matter. And so they, all these companies in trying to provide their bona fides in the financial services sector, there was a lot of attention on how do we improve the landscape for Black consumers, especially with respect to home ownership, because there's a huge gap between the percentage of what white households that are homeowners versus Black and Latino households. And one of the measures that's been really touted, really aggressively pushed is rent reporting. Right now, a lot of renters don't have their rent payments reported to the big three credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. The estimates are anywhere from 2 to 3% to 10%. And there's an intuitive appeal to rent reporting when it's first brought up. A lot of people are like, well, homeowners get the benefit of good credit records from their mortgage payments. Why shouldn't renters get that same benefit? And that the bad stuff shows up, but not the good stuff, and that's not fair. But the problem is that there are a lot of vulnerable renters, and we're going to talk about it later. Also, the thing about the bad stuff showing up, when bad stuff usually shows up as a kind of a one-off, it's usually reported by debt collectors, and it's arrears from a broken lease or damages. And so not all landlords report arrears or damages. And so the issue there really is the debt collection aspect and sometimes sketchy claims for back rent or damages. So there have been some pilot projects about rent reporting, and the data shows that it can help credit scores anywhere from 10 points to 23 points to 60 points. Obviously, 10 and 23 points are sort of modest increases in a credit score. 60 points is, a lot more, a lot bigger of an increase. However, even with 60 points, the benefit of rent reporting is kind of limited because only 12% of the folks who got in that study went up a full tier in their credit score. In other words, they went from subprime to near prime or near prime to prime. They passed a cutoff. And that's what's really important, to pass the cutoff, because that's what gives you the lower rate or gives you the ability to be approved. So next slide, please. So the thing I really want to talk about is what are the risks, because it does sound intuitively attractive and positive from a racial justice standpoint initially when you look at it superficially. But the problem is that rent reporting, if you do it the wrong way, has the potential to hurt renters. And it's the most vulnerable renters, the population that you all care about the most, who struggle with the rent every month, who might miss a month or two, but then catch up. And the pandemic really amplified these concerns because, during the pandemic, at some point between 6 to 13 million households were behind in the rent, but they may not have been displaced because of the eviction moratoria, and they might have caught up because of emergency rental assistance. And these households all would have had negative credit reporting if there had been what's called full file credit reporting. In other words, there's monthly reporting that includes both the positive and the negative. So what we don't want is the negative, because landlords, housing providers use credit reports and screening. And while, a missed credit card payment or, a middling score might not bar a renter from finding housing, negative rent reporting information definitely will. And so, these 6 to 13 million households would have all negative information, and they're definitely disproportionately renters of color. In fact, the Urban Institute did a report on rent reporting too. And one of the things they noted was that for Black renters during a 1-year period, there was data showing that only 55% of the Black renters had 12 months of on-time payments, which means 45% had at least 1 month where they were late in the rent during that 1-year period. So, it's probably not going to be the kind of boon that people are thinking it will, and it could have the potential to hurt the most vulnerable, because literally, negative rent reporting information could cause housing providers to turn down renters. We also feel strongly about opt-in, because we think it should be the consumer's choice whether to report their rent or not. We've had too many 50 years where we have no control whether our information goes to the big 3 credit bureaus. That needs to change. Plus, renters often need to pay for rent reporting. It's part of the numerous fees that we're seeing renters get socked with. And so they should have a choice, because they shouldn't have to pay if they're not interested in rent reporting, if they already have a good credit score, and definitely if negative information is being reported about them. And, even just positive information could have a downside. If you have an account showing 6 months of rent payment and then all of a sudden it disappears, a landlord could make negative inferences. And there's a better way to do that. The thing is, especially for mortgages, if you really want to include rent information, there's a way to do it without feeding all this data to the credit bureaus. And that's through looking at bank account transactions via these third parties called data aggregators like Finicity or Plaid. You can actually look in the bank account and pick up the rent payments through checks or electronic withdrawals. And that's a way to do it and bypass the big 3 credit bureau, maybe reduce a little bit of their monopoly power. And it doesn't cost the renter anything. It's interesting, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are both using this now, or are both allowing the use of this cash bank account transaction data. And so they actually have 2 programs, both of them. They have the bank account transaction program, and then they have another program to encourage their multifamily borrowers to report the tenants using rent reporting. And that's positive only data, so that part is good. What we were not as thrilled about is it's some of the providers they're using, the third-party platforms to do rent reporting, is not opt-in, it's opt-out. It's automatic, then you have to opt out. Next slide, please. And so to give you an illustration of the potential harms of negative rent reporting is a story from a private practitioner who was doing pro bono work in Alabama about what he was seeing, that negative rent reporting was literally driving some clients to homeless shelters. And by the way, if you do have similar examples of potential problems with rent reporting, please, I would love to get, it's super important to get information from the fields, from folks like you who see what's going on, because it's very influential with a lot of policymakers, regulators, and legislative staffers. And by the way, speaking of feedback, we also have a survey going on right now. We are going to be sending comments to the Federal Trade Commission in its rulemaking on junk fees. We're going to submit a comment on junk fees in the rental housing context, and we have a survey monkey out looking for information in the field, and I will post that survey monkey to the chat as well. So thank you. And if folks have questions, do we doing Q&A now or after?
Oh yes, sorry about that. Yeah, there are a couple of questions here. One, just a comment from an anonymous person, and just a reminder to everyone else, they can ask questions in the Q&A box. But just reminding folks that the people who are most in need of having their credit built won't necessarily benefit from automatically having their rent payments on their credit, which you covered. So I appreciate that. One person's asking about who is supporting measures to have full rent reporting. The way they put it is that if half the country can't afford a $500 emergency expense, who thought that mandatory rent reporting would have been beneficial to low-income people? Can you share anything more about who's actively pushing this?
Yeah, so the entities that are pushing this, some of it is industry, like TransUnion, the credit bureau, has a racial equity task force, which I find, I mean, I call it woke washing, which is they try to say that they're concerned about racial justice, but what they're trying to do is gather more data. I mean, credit bureaus love data. That's their stock and trade. That's their commodity. And rent reporting is more data. So they love this and they're pushing it. But unfortunately, there are others that are pushing it as well. So there's been a couple of legislators. Senator Scott from South Carolina is a proponent of this. And there have been some nonprofits, including this group in North Carolina called Policy and Economic Research Council, PERC, that have been pushing this too. And so, and it's not necessarily all bad. Again, rent reporting is okay if it's positive only and opt-in. Mm-hmm. And so some groups that are pushing it are positive only, like Credit Builders Alliance. So it has to be done in the right way, because you don't want to benefit like the folks who are credit invisible, but maybe the most capable and have the best ability at the expense of the most vulnerable renters. Because landlords, as I said, landlords, like something like 60 to 90% of landlords use credit reports, and they see one negative rent related item and that's it. That person is, not going to be able, they're going to have a really, really hard time finding housing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about, you mentioned that FHFA is overseeing, well, Fannie and Freddie have programs that touch on rent reporting in some way, but can you share who makes the decision about whether credit agencies can collect this information? Is it made on a lender by lender basis, or who would make the determination about whether or not credit agencies can carry this information?
So under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, there is no prohibition for rent reporting. The reason you don't see a lot of rent reporting on credit reports right now is because of the structure of the rental housing industry, that originally you had a lot of small landlords that just didn't even know where to plug in to do rent reporting. Now, of course, that's changing. There are more large corporate landlords, and there's all these efforts where even small landlords can do rent reporting through a third-party platform. So there's nothing really preventing it, except that it does end up costing money because you need to use a third party. And so a lot of, and landlords, housing providers don't need to do this. That's the thing. That's another reason why it's never been prevalent. Because as a housing provider, if your tenant doesn't pay the rent, eventually you've got this huge leverage, unfortunately, which is eviction. But a credit card company doesn't have as much leverage to collect on its debts, which is why it relies on credit reporting. And same thing with debt collectors.
And so is there any response that you've gotten from Fannie or Freddie or from other policymakers at the federal level about maybe wanting to put in limits on the ability to use rent reporting?
So in terms of limits, I mean, what we really want to see, and this is another different topic, is restrictions on the use of credit reports in tenant screening. Because not only would this deal with this problem, so then, at least you wouldn't have the negative housing consequences of rent reporting if you report negative information, but also we're seeing a lot of people being shut out of housing, rental housing, because of impaired credit generally. And first of all, it doesn't make great sense because we know someone might not pay their credit card, but they'll pay their rent, right? Because the rent eats first. And there's a disparate impact in terms of who's got low credit scores, as I mentioned. So we actually think restricting the use of credit reports and scores in rental housing is something that we should be pushing, because it's hurting a lot, especially low income tenants and some vulnerable groups, like domestic violence survivors are one group that often has impaired credit and trouble finding housing. Another group is voucher holders. Like, you literally do not need credit or financial screening. The voucher holder, the government is paying the rent. And we actually see credit checks being used as a backdoor way of excluding voucher holders when you have source of income discrimination provisions in a state like California or Massachusetts.
I'm so glad that you raised that. And you had mentioned that you have a national call that folks can join if they want more information. But more generally, what can advocates do if they want to take action on this? So
advocates can definitely advocate at the state level. I mean, they can advocate at the federal level, obviously, and see if Congress is willing to do anything. But often states are the first responders in dealing with emerging situations. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau recently helped in this area by saying that state laws that restrict what goes into a tenant screening report, for example, are not preempted or not overridden by the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. So we're encouraging states and state advocates to regulate more around tenant screening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Chi-Chi. I learned a lot from you and look forward to working with you more to help make sure that we can limit the risks for rent reporting. And I hope a lot of folks on the line will follow your lead and weigh in with their state legislatures about this.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go next to our update from the ERASE team. This is the End Rental Arrears to Stop Eviction team. And Neetu Nair is going to join us to share the latest.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And hi, everyone. I'm going to give a quick presentation on our new report, Serving Native American Households Using ERA. Next slide, please. So ERA1 provided around $800 million to assistance to around 301 Native American tribes and TDHEs. Previous research that we released revealed challenges and barriers faced by TDHEs in implementing their programs, including limited rental housing, low administrative capacity, short spending timelines, and in many cases, small ERA allocations. But despite these challenges, we saw that TDHEs have experienced varying levels of success in administering their ERA program. So this brief, in partnership with the United Native American Housing Association, investigates the unique characteristics of high-spending tribal and TDHE ERA programs. We selected 7 TDHEs in UNAHA's network to participate in this research, representing Native American communities in the Great Plains. So this research draws on data collected through an internal UNAHA survey on ERA spending and from interviews conducted by NLIHC staff with program administrators at these 7 sites. Next slide, please. So figure 1 on the left shows TDHE spending over time. ERA1 spending increased rapidly between the second and the third quarters of 2021, and then increased furthermore in the first 2 quarters of 2022. And by March 2022, TDHEs had spent about 411.6 million, or roughly 51% of their initial allocation. The 7 sites chosen for this study represent high-spending TDHEs. These TDHEs also stand in contrast to their respective state-based ERA programs, many of which tended to be slow spending grantees, as demonstrated by figure 2 on the right here. Every TDHE with available data spent a large portion of its initial allocation compared to its respective state grantee. In all but 2 cases, we found that the TDHE spent more than 100% of its initial allocation due to the availability of reallocated ERA1 funds. But to note here is that each state grantee here eventually reallocated more than 60% of their initial ERA1 allocation as well. Next slide. So our brief investigates the strategies adopted by these TDHEs to quickly and effectively spend down their ERA1 funds. Firstly, we found that all 7 grantees interviewed here took advantage of ERA resources to serve both non-tribal members on native lands and those members living outside of the TDHE standard service area for at least a portion of their ERA program. While many of the grantees initially only served households within their native lands or within their service areas, factors like the need among tribal households, the lack of rental units on native lands, and the tight spending timeline of ERA1 really pushed administrators to expand their service area through the course of the program. The provision of rental assistance to households outside of native lands is a unique feature of ERA as compared to other Native American housing assistance programs, typically like those funded under IHBG, which have tended to focus on tribal areas only. Administrators felt that expanding the service area was important due to the large number of low-income Native American households in need outside of native lands due to the scarcity of rental units on native lands. Next slide. We saw that the financial instability experienced by households prior to the pandemic was made particularly acute by rising costs during the pandemic. For necessities, things like food and medical services, particularly among households on fixed incomes or assistance, resulting in a lot of households doubling or tripling up with friends or relatives to cut down on costs. So overcrowding was of particular concern given its negative impacts on household members' abilities to follow social distancing protocols during the pandemic, which in turn obviously had greater impacts on health risk, especially for households with elderly members. So TDHEs found really creative ways to use ERA funds to address overcrowding in the short term, particularly by leveraging ERA funds to help households secure their own leases for housing off native lands by paying for security deposits and relocation assistance, as well as the allowable 3 months of future rent. Administrators also relied on alternative housing like temporary campers and mobile homes for households experiencing homelessness, and oftentimes paid lot rents to keep those households out of congregate shelters during the pandemic. Next slide. We also found that to effectively serve households both in their local communities and nationally, administrators leverage their existing networks to get the word out about these ERA programs. They also formed new partnerships with their state ERA grantees and other TDHE grantees for program implementation and technical assistance, coordination of ERA assistance, and outreach to renter households. Next slide. And finally, we see that TDHEs adopted a lot of Treasury ERA flexibilities and the best practices advocated over the course of the pandemic, such as the use of self-attestations for one or more required documents to quickly and effectively serve households in need. Several programs also revised their applications over time to reduce the barriers to applying. They adopted strategies like embedding self-attestations directly into their applications or including only multiple choice questions rather than asking for short descriptions, all in efforts to ease the process of applying for assistance. Next slide. Across the board, we heard that administrators really appreciated the dedicated stream of funding for emergency rental assistance and acknowledged that these funds really did help keep renters stably housed. However, all 7 administrators spoke of the challenges that they faced in spending this unprecedented level of funding with limited support and technical assistance. One program administrator stated that they had to spend a significant amount of their administrative allowance on extra legal services to ensure that they were interpreting and following the guidance correctly after not receiving clear communication from Treasury staff early on. They also highlighted that despite investing their full 10% administrative allowance to build up capacity, programs were really overwhelmed by the number of applications they received and had to bring in staff from different departments to help with application processing. And to note here is that TDHEs were ineligible to receive ERA2 funds, which would have not only extended the period of assistance to 18 months and moved the spending deadline to December 2025, but it would have also provided these grantees with the flexibilities to use a portion of their funds for other affordable rental housing purposes, such as the construction or preservation of affordable housing projects. And having access to those flexibilities could have provided TDHEs opportunities to address overcrowding, especially in even more substantial ways than they did with ERA1. And finally, administrators reaffirmed the widespread need among tribally affiliated households for continued emergency rental assistance. Sustained funding for ERA would also ensure that the infrastructure and knowledge developed by these TDHEs during the pandemic would not be lost. They also noted that access to sustained funding would help them to leverage additional funds to construct and build more affordable rental housing on native lands and retain households. And above all, our research found that ERA truly just made evident the need for long-term financial support for Native American households living both on and off native lands. Next slide. So our report goes further into the nuances of providing assistance to member households across the country and details out the strategies discussed in this presentation here. And you can read more about these findings in the link here, and I'll be sure to drop that in the chat as well. And as always, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer these. And you can, my email is presented here, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Neetu. It's really important that the research team undertook this work. I know that you worked really closely with our tribal partners to put it together. One of the things that I noticed out of the report is that a lot of the analysis that you, shared really points to many of the long-term challenges in tribal nations and the need for more resources there overall. I know you mentioned overcrowding, the lack of housing supply, the need for more capacity building. Is there anything that you wanted to share from that perspective about what this tells you about long-term needs?
Yeah, I think what was so interesting in this study is how TDHEs really used this funding to, even in the short term, address overcrowding, which is how housing instability is oftentimes manifested on native lands. It just showed that even in the short term, having the funds and having the flexibility that ERA provided, especially by providing reallocation assistance, helping to fund security deposits, which oftentimes administrators highlighted was the thing that would prevent folks from actually being able to secure new housing. And having ERA to fill that gap really made a difference in providing that long-term stability. So having these funds for a sustained amount of time, which a lot of administrators highlighted was, their wish list at the end of this program, that would really help them continue to do this important work for households in need.
Wonderful. And I thought I would just also share with other folks on the line that one of the other challenges that tribal nations had was dealing with a very short deadline period. They did not receive ERA2 funds. They only received ERA1 funds. And so the deadline, I think, expires at the end, maybe at the end of September, and they were working to get, I'm looking to Kayla in the chat box, but working to get an extension of that, which would have allowed them to continue to their funds. Maybe on a future call, we can ask Dave Heisterkamp to join with us and share a little bit more about that effort. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but I want to thank you so much for joining me too. Thank you for your very in-depth work on this report and for sharing with us what you learned.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Absolutely. We're going to go ahead to our next speaker. We're going to hear from our field updates. First up is Andronika Morris from Housing NOLA, who's going to share about what's working and not working in Louisiana.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Y'all hear me okay?
Perfect.
So that is a loaded question that Sarah just asked right there. What's working and not working. So when we talk about, just to remind everybody, our philosophy in New Orleans is, and in Louisiana, we are organized under what we call the Put Housing First banner. And the Put Housing First banner is really simple. We think that, and we can prove that every major issue that needs to be addressed in Louisiana has a root, finds a root, particularly those issues that are that are just society issues that are rooted in housing inequity, that are being interrupted by housing inequity. And because of the very American problem of not dealing with housing directly, particularly the intersection between race and gender that permeates housing, we are far falling behind. In Louisiana, because of some unfortunate circumstances, we've come to that revelation a little bit earlier than than the rest of the country. Namely, that revelation that enlightenment happened as a result of the disaster that was Hurricane Katrina. And seeing how, as we were desperate to create housing opportunities for people to come back and to rebuild their lives, and the world looked to Louisiana and looked at New Orleans and said, what's happened here is wrong and disproportionately hurting Black and brown people, and we want to help. And then the 10 years after, where despite billions of dollars coming in, our estimates are about $50 billion came into New Orleans the 10 years after Katrina, just into the housing space, creating 88,000 new housing opportunities. And that not being enough, not because it wasn't enough money, but because we didn't have a strategy. And we didn't have a strategy that addressed the systemic biases that you find often, that all of us deal with every day when we talk about guaranteeing housing for all and ending housing insecurity in our communities. New Orleans came to this early, and so we formed the Housing NOLA initiative to put together a plan, a process to first put in place what would create a new system, the levers responsible, enshrine the racial equity analysis inside of that, looking at more vulnerable populations, like the formerly incarcerated, homeless, culture bearers, people who are unique to a place like New Orleans, who struggle even more. And there are other folks as well. Some of the usual suspects are inside of that grouping: people with disabilities, immigrant populations. That's something that we share with other places, but we also wanted to talk about the people who are particularly imperiled if they live and work and call New Orleans home inside that planning process. So part of that planning process was also a requirement that this not just be a plan on a shelf, right? A book on a pretty set of pictures or some ambitions that would never be met, that this would in fact be an actionable plan. So also getting to the idea of holding policymakers and elected officials accountable, and not just getting their commitment in the room and then never coming back again and not holding them to it. So we included in that an annual report card process that was quite controversial at the time, and is still quite controversial at the time, where we would look at the policy, that a community review team, citizens who would set the agenda for the year would also review the progress made or the progress not made, and then using those metrics, issue a grade on the state of housing. And unfortunately, for the last 3 years, we've had the distinction of New Orleans has been failing for the last 3 years, not moving forward. And that despite it has been somewhat helpful in the sense that community is clear, right? People are no longer being gaslit. No, when people are not thinking, when our elected officials say, well, I care about public housing, or I'm sorry, I care about affordable housing. Well, why didn't you vote for this policy? Why didn't you introduce this policy? Why didn't you appropriate these resources? Why didn't you call for this, right? They can share that with them. And then also, again, tracking the investment opportunities. We've also pivoted and made sure that while sharing the grades is helpful, we also need to be talking about the investment opportunities. We need to be getting community partners who are ready to participate helpfully, get them together and have an investment strategy. So we actually, unfortunately, because of things like COVID and subsequent hurricanes that have hit New Orleans, the affordable housing crisis has gotten even worse. So where initially, when we launched the plan, there was a need for about 33,000 affordable housing opportunities. That number has increased significantly. And the cost has increased significantly given what's happening with construction prices, insurance, utilities, the upgrades necessary to make communities resistant. The needs have changed. And that's where we are now, where we have a new Housing for All investment strategy that is meant to work along with the existing Housing NOLA plan. And those things together are setting us up to go after ARPA dollars, to go after IIJA dollars, to go after IRA dollars, and to hold community accountable and to look to our private partners, right? We need to be talking about that $50 billion that I mentioned before. That was not all federal recovery grants, not even close, right? It was mostly, the lion's share of it was insurance proceeds and bank financing, the private bank financing that was secured either by homeowners or property owners to rebuild back, to bring people home and to give people housing opportunity. We needed more than that, and we needed that money used much more effectively and much more thoughtfully. But there's a real need to make sure that in addition to getting the public resources, that the private resources are there as well. And the Housing NOLA plan captures all of that. It is not simply, while we would argue, I certainly do argue, that a lot of our public officials are not doing their part. One, as regulators, if our housing markets were better regulated by public officials, if there were clear, straightforward rules that around the notion of guaranteeing housing for all, around things as simple as zoning, as simple as code enforcement, then the private market could be more comfortable. Also, we need to talk about regulating to make sure that the private actors, when we heard earlier, we were talking about predatory landlords, slum landlords, people who take advantage of vulnerable renters, and even people who take advantage of homeowners, unscrupulous contractors. The lack of regulation also impacts the private market that way. It's not just about getting banks and financiers comfortable. It's also about making sure that housing that exists currently, that is occupiable, doesn't fall into disrepair. Again, not just leaning on the tired old tropes of poor Black and brown people not being able to take care of their property, renters who tear up properties. We're talking about what also happens inside of the market, which is that people are not, that property owners are not held accountable. They are not held responsible for how they impact our communities. So that's where we are in New Orleans. And we've also continued to replicate this work across the state of Louisiana, working with the Housing Louisiana Network. And so there are 9 regional housing alliances and or working groups across Louisiana. So they're self-selecting. There's the North Shore, there's East Baton Rouge, Shreveport, Alexandria, North Shore, home of Thibodaux. And so we are also increasing that work with more organizing. So each regional housing alliance also is going to have a resident organizing chapter. What we want with the housing alliances are they're going to be the more traditional professional housing organizations. They do the advocacy, the policy research, but we also want to make sure that there is a place for community inside of that. and it doesn't necessarily have to be as formal or structured, because we do want to get to a place where community is driving so much of this work. We've been, one of the things that's been, and I'm going to geek out and be like all policy nerdy and everything like that, and talk about how much fun we've been having with things like with organizing, and particularly the electoral work that's been happening that is cause for excitement, where we are looking at our public service races like Public Service Commission. These are the folks who regulate the rates for utilities. And as all of you know, housing affordability isn't just rent or your mortgage, it's also your utilities. And in a place like Louisiana, where we have the third highest energy cost burden in the country, when it comes to what our neighbors and friends pay, this is not a small part of this thing. This is not a small part of the puzzle. And we've been able to continue to push on that intersectional piece. Energy efficiency, energy code, all that leads inside of construction. It also has a clear connection to climate change. And again, this is something that we in Louisiana care a lot about. Climate intensified storms like Hurricane Katrina and like Hurricane Ida are a continuous threat, not just to people's lives, but also to the communities that we all cherish. If we don't do something to reverse climate change, Louisiana will not look like Louisiana in 100 years, much less or 50 years. So that is that lets us connect with other partners, climate change partners, for whom the concept of put housing first might be a little uncomfortable for them. But once we talk to them about, hey, you know what we could do today to reduce carbon emissions dramatically? Making homes net zero. And so getting those folks who have a lot of energy and access to a lot of resources connected around housing, and understanding why something like the Public Service Commission is a race that they should get involved in. We've had some success with that, and also looking at other climate change initiatives with the housing perspective as key. So we've been able to work with national groups, and as well as be anchor partners inside of statewide tables like the Energy Efficiency for All table and the Gulf South for Green New Deal table. In other communities, we know from meeting our counterparts from across the country, not every one of those spaces has housing partners. And so we've been pushing on that as well, and it's given us the opportunity to talk about connecting our organizing work, our electoral work, and our policy and advocacy work together around some shared priorities and some shared initiatives. Because if when the Public Service Commission race is over, we also have to talk about that continued policy and advocacy work to make sure that we've got the investments necessary to make sure that people, when the worst happens and they've got to evacuate, they can come home. The worst happens and their home is resilient, as opposed to us relying on them being resilient. And so, Sarah, I forgot to ask how much time I had.
No, you're good. I'm looking forward to people asking questions in the Q&A box, but I just wanted to say, I always appreciate hearing from you about the work you're doing, because it's always on the cutting edge of looking about how can we put forward the voices of people with lived experience? How do we bring the community to really drive the decisions that are being made? The work that you've done, the intersectional work, especially between climate change and housing. Of course, not to age you, but you've been doing this for quite a while. I look to you as being an important expert in this space, and I don't see any questions, but I really appreciate you joining with us and sharing your insights and about what you're doing down in Louisiana.
Thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely. We're going to go to our next speaker, Julia Fowler from Pathways to Housing DC.
Oh, Sarah, I think I saw a question. Somebody said, what's driving high energy costs? Yeah, sure. You can take that.
So
Alicia asked the question, in a place like Louisiana, what's driving high energy costs? Because our public service commissioners, the elected, the incumbents, all like to, and so does utility companies, love to brag about our rates being so low. what drives our high energy costs in Louisiana is the quality or lack of quality in our housing stock. That is one of our big problems, because of the lack of financial investment. Our communities are poorer. People can't get financing to rehab their homes. And so that also is a problem for landlords and property owners who often rent to low to moderate income folks. Those properties are not well insulated. And again, you got to also go back, our housing stock is much older. You got to go back to the fact that 100 years ago, 150 years ago, when folks were settling here in New Orleans or in Louisiana, we actually were on the cutting edge of building technologies. A lot of our homes are elevated and built up so that they can conduct air because it's very hot here. And so now you fast forward and you're in a 120-year-old house that was designed to bring air in. Now you've cut it up with modern HVAC systems that leak, or you're trying to put in window units and all of that, they're rotting out the windows. And so the reason our rates are so low is because our utility companies make it up on volume. So the quality of our housing is it's a huge part of the problem. That's why energy efficiency, making homes net zero, is such a big priority and such a great intersectional issue. It will lower our carbon footprint. It will strengthen the quality of our homes to make them more likely to survive the next hurricane or disaster that comes through. And it will lower the costs of that home for those families, letting them live in a healthier, safer, and more affordable and resilient home.
And also helps you make that connection, like you said, to other sectors who
That's right.
also are focused on this issue too. So thank you to Alicia for asking the question. And thank you, Andronika, for joining with us. Now we'll move ahead, as I mentioned, to Julia Fowler from Pathways to Housing DC, another giant in the housing field, especially their work around ending homelessness. And so, Julia, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for having me here today. So as Sarah said, my name is Julia Fowler. I'm the encampment program manager for the Pathways Care team. And CARE stands for Coordinated Assistance and Resources for Encampments. So we have been in existence for a little over a year now. And the CARE program was launched by DC Mayor Bowser to address the needs of individuals living in some of the largest encampments in DC. So two of the encampments that my team focused on were the NOMA in New Jersey and O encampments. There were quite a bit of safety and health concerns within those two encampments. And as a result, they were given a closure date. And instead of displacing those residents within those two encampments, through the program, they were offered housing and rental payment support. So months prior to the closure of the encampments were highly monitored by Pathways staff to determine who were the residents in these encampments, what supports were needed, and to also get them prepared for the closure. And we kept track of all of that information through our by name lists. So my team consists of myself and 6 other outreach specialists that provide intensive on-site case management support to clients that were previously in the NOMA, New Jersey, no encampments. We work very closely with our housing department to assist clients with identifying and applying for a unit of their choice. We were very fortunate to work with our housing department that already had existing relationships with landlords. So many landlords were receptive to working with our clients through this program. And the clients received case management support from my team until they were permanently matched to a housing resource, such as permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, site-based voucher, et cetera. So our clients will go through, as far as getting matched to a housing provider, they will go through the traditional process of getting matched. But the difference through this program is that they get the opportunity to be housed while they wait to be matched to a provider. Also, we are in collaboration with the Department of Behavioral Health to link any clients in need of mental health support to a mental health provider. So Pathways to Housing stands by the housing first model. And to us, that means that there are no conditions that have to be met before the person moves in. And so the good thing about this program is that it utilizes the housing first model of services, and where the clients were able to move into housing that was appropriate for them, regardless of whether they had all their vital documents or regardless of whether they completed the housing assessment or not. We were able to work with the individuals to obtain those things while they were in the comfort of their own space. So some of the things that we found successful with this program is that we had a few clients that were homeless for decades and didn't believe that they would ever get housed. And they couldn't believe, like, when we came and approached them and told them that they could apply to an apartment today, that they could actually move pretty soon. So it was nice to see some of the clients that were initially reluctant to housing finally become more receptive. And also clients who were reluctant, them seeing their friends or other residents of the encampments get housed, it motivated them to get housed as well, which was really nice. So out of this, we had 77 individuals that were on our by name list. And out of the 77 that were housed, 77 that were on that list, 62 of those individuals were housed within the first year of the program. And we were able to connect 49 individuals to resources needed, such as substance use treatment programs, food banks within their areas, employment programs, medication management, etc. And what was really nice was to see that we had quite a few clients that re-engaged with family members. So we had a lot of success stories, but with the roses, there are some thorns. And so there were some things that we would have liked to see differently, or that we took away from this past year. And that those things are that with our housing team having existing relationships with landlords, we had a good pool of landlords that were willing to work with us, but we would like to see more throughout DC. We also received crisis management support, but we would have loved to have collaborated with a psychiatrist or a psychiatrist or that could provide support in the field on a consistent basis to our mentally vulnerable clients. And clients who declined or tended to decline the offer of housing were typically clients who were who had serious mental illnesses. And we would have liked to have had more time for assertive and creative engagement prior to closure dates. But we do continue to work with those individuals within the community and provide any support needed to include mental health support. That is all that I wanted to share. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Julia. I am so glad that you're on the line. One, because I'm going to remind folks on this call that because of just a tremendous amount of interest in the Homelessness and Housing First webinars that the National Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities were holding earlier this summer, we've restarted those national calls, national webinars, and our first one in this new series is next Monday. And so it's a great opportunity for people to learn more about Housing First as you mentioned, and how it has become the most successful strategy for ending homelessness that we have. But on that, I wanted to mention that, one of the things we hear, also the reason why we're having those webinars is because Housing First is under enormous threat right now. We're seeing both policymakers at the state and local level, at the federal level, push back against proven solutions like Housing First. And there's a lot of disinformation about what Housing First is and why it's so important. So I'd love to ask you, one of the things that you mentioned is the importance of choice, that people who are experiencing homelessness have the decision about whether to apply for housing and where they might want to live. I wanted you to, if it's okay, to speak a little bit more about why choice is so central to Housing First and to ending homelessness.
Yeah, well, I will speak through our personal experience that clients who were given the choice were more open to housing, knowing that, so a lot of our clients have lived in DC, and them knowing that they're able to apply for a unit that is away from all the stuff that they've ever known, kind of get a fresh start, has opened them to the idea of exploring housing for themselves.
And can you share, there are a couple of folks who are asking if you could repeat the name of the program, specifically the part of the program that allowed for housing applicants to be moved to housing even if they didn't have documentation. I think you're on mute still, hold on.
Sorry. Yeah, so I could put that in the chat as well. Care, coordinated assistance, and resources for encampments. And this pilot was launched under DC Mayor Bowser. And I can also put the link in for the Q&A that's on the Department of Human Services website, if that's helpful for more information.
Yeah, wonderful. And I see that there also is a question from Carrie Bristow who's asking, does DC have a landlord engagement program, or is that something that you want to see created? Because you mentioned the need for more landlords in your pipeline.
Yeah, so that question is, so I have Dr. Dice, who is also on the call. She is a participant. I don't know if we can, I would like to defer to her if we can get her on.
I don't think she is on as a panelist.
No, she's on as a, okay. And I can put her contact information in the chat as well.
Yeah, we can also look for other opportunities to hear from them about their experience. And then the last question I wanted to ask is about wanting more about partnering with mental health providers or mental health services. Can you talk a little bit more about how Housing First combines both housing and services?
So that question, I would like to also defer to.
No worries. I'm not going to put you on the spot, Julia. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry, you guys.
No, you're doing great.
I don't do very well with
everyone on the call is going to show Julia some love in the chat box, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining with us. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so now I am going to share my update on what's happening in Capitol Hill. Next slide, please. So things are getting a little bit messy with the appropriations process right now. There is no agreement between Republicans and Democrats about, let me take a step back. It shows that I'm going to talk a little bit about where things are with the final spending bill for fiscal year 2023, and a little bit about tax extenders. And the reason why I'm talking about both of those things is because this is really the last opportunity that we have this year to expand housing resources. So first, I'm going to talk about the FY23 budget. As you know, Congress has to pass an annual spending bill every year. But since the start of the fiscal year on October 1st, we've been, the Congress has operated the federal government under what's called a continuing resolution. Just kicks the can down the road so they can make decisions about the budget later on. Right now, the CR expires December 16th in about 10 days, but we are far away from seeing an agreement between Republicans and Democrats. Like I said earlier, they haven't reached an agreement on how much to spend overall. And before they come to some sort of an agreement on top line spending, it means that the appropriations committees can't figure out how much funding would go to every priority, including housing. The issue at hand is that there's a disagreement between Republicans and Democrats about how much should go towards defense spending and how much should go to domestic programs like housing programs and other programs. Both parties agree that there needs to be an increase to defense spending. And in fact, Senate Republicans and Democrats last week reached essentially an agreement to increase military spending by about 10% over last year's funding levels. But the question about how much should go towards domestic programs is still unanswered. And Democrats say that they don't want to vote for higher military spending unless we also see increases in domestic programs. You may remember that this has long been the Democratic negotiating point, that they wanted to see equal funding increases for both domestic programs and defense programs. But of course, Republicans have not yet agreed to that. Democrats have proposed about $813 billion for domestic programs. That's about $26 billion more than what Republicans say that they're willing to take. And it's only a slight increase above what the Senate proposed earlier this year. You may remember that is of concern to me, of course, because the Senate bill, while it provided funding increases for housing programs, it was not nearly as expansive as the House proposal. In fact, the Senate proposal was about $3 billion less than the House had proposed. And that has a real impact on the resources that communities have. One clear example is with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, where the House proposed to expand vouchers to another 140,000 households, but the Senate bill proposed to serve an additional 5,000 or less households. So where Democrats and Republicans come out in terms of spending levels at the top line has a huge impact on what we can get for housing. Next slide, please. Okay. So Democrats we're starting to see some more political maneuvering to try to negotiate this package. Democrats say that they're going to prepare a bill at the funding levels that they want and to bring it to the floor for a possible vote. But Republicans are not going to vote for it. And as we know, any appropriations bill needs to have 60 votes in the Senate, which means that you have to have Republican votes in order to pass it. And so it means we're at a little bit of an impasse here. And there's increasing pressure potentially on Democrats to decrease the amount of money that they're willing to spend on domestic programs. So that's one clear threat to housing this year. The second is that there's an increased risk if Congress is unable to reach an agreement that the backup plan will be for them to pass a year-long continuing resolution so basically funding us all the way through next September. What's troubling about that is that a continuing resolution just keeps funding levels at the level from the previous year. And so there wouldn't be any increases to address these record high inflation that we've seen in communities. And so that means that as rent has gone up in many communities by huge amounts, that wouldn't be reflected in higher funding levels for HUD programs, including HUD rental assistance programs. And so in the end, just having level funding for HUD, if there was a year-long CR, really acts like there's a cut to housing programs. So we really need all hands on deck for all housing advocates to be talking to their members of Congress, especially Republican members of Congress, to encourage them to reach a deal this year on the spending package and to fund housing programs at the highest level possible, especially when it comes to funding new vouchers. So what I have here is a QR code that you can use right now to pull up a link to our national letter. You can sign on. We're just a couple of signatures away from having 2,000 organizations onto this letter. I really want to encourage you guys to sign on to it if you're not on there now, share it with your networks. But even more importantly is for you to start making phone calls to your members of Congress now to try to put pressure on them before that December 16th deadline comes up. Okay, next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about efforts to expand and reform the low-income housing tax credit. We've talked about this before in the past, that there's a big effort right now to use a tax extenders bill at the end of the year to increase resources for the low-income housing tax credit. And as many of you know, LIHTC is a critical resource for financing. It's the largest resource that we have, but on its own, it's just not enough to serve people who have the greatest needs, who have the lowest incomes, and who are the most marginalized. And so if there's a path forward on expanding LIHTC, we also want to see reforms put in place to better serve those households. Next slide. So just a quick reminder about what we're hoping to see. We want to see not just an expansion of LIHTC, but also an expanded basis boost for developments that set aside at least 20% of their units to be affordable to households with extremely low incomes. And we want to see 8% of all LIHTC resources put towards this purpose to help offset the costs. Both of these were included in the Build Back Better Act, and the first one was also included in the Cantwell-Young bipartisan low-income housing tax credit bill. Next slide. We also want to make sure that rural communities and tribal nations have a better shot at accessing LIHTC resources. It's very difficult oftentimes for these communities to compete for LIHTC, but by designating them as difficult to develop areas, it means that they could be eligible for a 30% basis boost. That would make it a little bit easier for those deals to pencil out so they can build more affordable housing in their areas. Next slide. So in terms of where things are on tax extenders, it looks a little unclear about what Republicans, again, might be willing to agree to. There's been back and forth between Republicans and Democrats on the committees, on the House Ways and Means committees and the Senate Finance Committee, but there hasn't really been a lot of decisions made about what's possible in a tax extenders package. Does not seem like there's agreement right now, at least, about whether housing could be included or what sorts of reforms might be alongside of it. But of course, as I mentioned, if there is an agreement, we want to make sure that members of Congress have heard from us about the need for reforms to go alongside any expansion. So I have here another QR code that you can use to bring you to our Take Action page, where you can send a letter to or an email to your members of Congress to encourage them to look at not just expanding the low-income housing tax credit, but also reforming it. I will say that I have heard some positive information about extending the 12.5% boost that LIHTC received in 2018, and that expired last year. But I know that there's a lot more conversations to be had around further expansion, including lowering the 50% basis test. If we hear more, and as we hear more, we'll let you guys know. But it's really important that you continue. And with that, I think we're gonna, well, I'm not gonna end the call early. I'm gonna see if there are any questions in the Q&A box. I see that there's a question from someone anonymous about any updates on the Ending Homelessness Act or the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. Just to give you guys a sense of these bills, the Ending Homelessness Act is from Chairwoman Maxine Waters. It would create a universal rental assistance program. The other bill, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, is from Senator Elizabeth Warren. A very comprehensive bill, but really the core of it is a $45 billion investment in the National Housing Trust Fund. We have endorsed that bill, both bills, and want to see it move forward. Right now, there isn't an opportunity to move there yet, but we feel like, especially with the appropriations bill, having such a huge expansion of vouchers as proposed in the House could help put us on a path towards universal rental assistance in the future. So while those bills aren't going to be moving right now, it's also important for you to talk to your members of Congress about the long-term vision about how we get to a place where every single person has an affordable place to live, an accessible place to live. And so you can definitely raise those bills with your members of Congress too. I see a question from, again, we have very active anonymous folks on the line today. A question that says, if our organizations have signed on to the letter and sent to our representatives advocacy letters regarding line tech, do you recommend we do so again, given the crunch time before December 16th, or primarily focus on phone calls? That's a great question. I think both. If you have a relationship with the Hill staffer in the offices of your members of Congress, you should email them, you should call them, you should try to put, tell them and educate them about why we need to have a final spending bill this year. That's a great piece of advice for other folks on the line who might want to be thinking about other ways to engage. I appreciate that. I don't see any other questions, but I really want to thank everybody for joining with us today. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks for our next National HoUSed call, and we'll talk to you next week if you want to join our webinar series on homelessness and housing first. Thank you, everybody.